السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أود أن أرحب بكم
I would like to welcome you in the second session of today, which will be about Arab and United States, the stereotype images between the two sides. My name is Khalil Jahshan from Washington, and recently and closely you will hear about opening bureaus in Washington for the Arab Center, and I'll be director of that center there in Washington. I would like to begin to extend my thanks to the organizers of this conference, not only for inviting me to take part in this session with my other colleagues about this important topic, but also because of the topic itself, because frankly speaking, the issue of stereotypes, images is not something new, and this is an international phenomena, and this phenomena is not restricted on the relations between USA and the Arab world, but this link between stereotype images and political decisions is something new and rare, relatively speaking. Most of the experts in the past and today focus, in fact, on the stereotypes in the media and the stereotypes in movie making, for example, in Hollywood, and the stereotypes in curriculum, textbooks, and whether in primary, intermediate, and secondary, or even university levels. This is important and necessary, but by my personal experience, which is working in governmental and government relations for 2 decades of time in the United States, I have come to the conclusion that the stereotype does have a lot of influence and effect on the foreign policy, and it and deserves more interest and attention than we have seen so far on academic or political levels. So the stereotypes that form a problem in the Arab-American relations, as we had so far, is a phenomena which is a mutual phenomena. So if you look at the presentations that we have today, for 4 of them that were distributed to you, and I would speak. One of the speakers did not, in fact, come. One of the panels did not come. But these presentations indicate that, in fact, this is a mutual phenomena. They are racist and some stereotype images in the way the Arabs look into to the Arabs and how the Americans look into the Arabs. This is so mutual phenomena and parallel, in fact. The Arab world, as we have noticed in many of the American media outlets, is accused that it is a violent world that practices violence and terrorism, and there's a lot of arms and weapons spread over, and none of the Arabs think of the instance by images they have taken from the Western movies that the United States also a violent society, and as a result of this culture, Western culture, which is imposed and imposes criminality in the United States, criminality that's not accepted by Arab thinking. Or the United States is accused of being a secular society that focuses on individual interests and at the expense of the society and the state. But this and that all Arabs, I think Americans think that all the Arabs are rich, and every Arab person has an oil well under his house, and the Arabs also think that all Americans are rich. So there are so many similar stereotype images that we see on both sides. So I would like to invite you, before we begin listening to the presentations, the three presentations we have, I want to invite you to focus on these topics that in fact include the issue of how to deal with these stereotypes between Arabs and Americans. So in addition to the saying that this is a mutual phenomena on both sides, there are also some stereotypes that seem to be continuing and going on, and despite the fact that there's some improvement or progress in facing and confronting the stereotypes during the past or 30 years ago. In addition to that, these stereotypes are also not restricted, and they are all over the society and are not limited to a certain social category. Many of the articles that speak of this topic refer to the stereotypes in the American media outlets, but also include decision makers. Anyone who wants to prove to that, I usually use the example as a person who dealt with decision makers in Washington for a long time, more than 25 years. And also during this period, I met at least 60 to 65 head of state or emir or king or ruler of an Arab country. I never felt that there's such a stereotype in the way each one looks at the other. And this is not restricted, as some people might think that when one reads these articles or books, one feels as if this is something restricted to the ordinary citizens or those who are not educated or intellectual. No, in fact, this even goes up to the leaderships and decision makers. And an air journey that I took from Washington to here, I read the book of Hillary Clinton, the new book of Hillary Clinton that was published this week, called the Hard or Difficult Decisions. There are about 100, it is a book of 100, there has about more than 100 pages about the Middle East and her positions regarding the Middle East. And I think if anyone wants to see how these stereotypes racist ones reach the decision makers' minds. For example, for this person who is a candidate for the presidency next year, one can find a lot of these stereotypes in what she wrote in her book, in her analysis. Of course, this book is not a memoir or souvenirs. No, it is the first step in her presidential campaign. And she can possibly become the next president of the United States. And this stereotype that are very clear in her writings might affect the policies of the country. I would like usually to remind the participants of any conference that the foreign State Department I dealt with in a very strong way was James Baker. And James Baker was a lawyer, well experienced in foreign policies, and he was intelligence. He also spoke the same language of the Western ranchers or farmers. I remember, for example, during the 10 negotiations with the Palestinians and Israelis in the beginning of the 90s in Washington, when the Palestinian delegation went in and asked to change the agenda of that meeting, Baker answered, so the market has begun and let's begin selling and buying. So it's not only the ordinary citizens, but even decision makers, American decision makers, think that everything in the Middle East is for sale. And of course, he was not meaning only the Palestinians, he meant also the Israelis. So he thinks that everything is in the Middle East is for sale or buying or selling. So it's all commerce. I will never forget this sentence that he Anyhow, we have three panelists, three speakers. As I said, Dr. Martha Rinsky from Northwest University could not come, unfortunately, as it is written in the program. But we will begin this session by a presentation of Shamseddin al-Dilami from the Arab Center here, and he will be speaking about how the image of the Arab and Islam. Then I will give the floor to Mohammed Bazian, who will be speaking of Palestine and Islamophobia and the role of those supporters of Israel in producing this racist discourse against the Muslims in the United States. Finally, Dr. Ayad al-Qazzaz from California State University in Sacramento. He will speak of the image of the Arab and Islam introductory sociology textbook in the US and the aftermath of 9/11. I give the floor to Mr. Shamseddin.
My paper will be on the image of the United States amongst the Arabs and the changes this image has gone through in the Arab mind towards this major country. It's known that each country has an image it composes as a result of its historical perspective, social life, and its relations with other countries, and this image is formed according to the relations between this nation and other nations. Of course, whether political or economic or military relations are the dominant factor, or whether or not there are some bad memories. The Arabs' relations with America has not taken one direction only. The relations between the Arabs and America started in some 200 years ago. The relations with Europe is longer, of course, but it was mired by political and military conflicts as well as commercial and scientific exchanges. But the Arabs found out about America since the 19th century, and this country did not leave any shocks in the Arab memory except until the mid-20th century. At the end of the 19th century, the relationship or the image formed by Arabs of America was a beautiful one. There was nothing antagonistic about it at all, although it was not a relationship defined by politics or economic relations, but a cultural one, educational one, and the missionary exchanges and missions in Lebanon, the Levant, and other countries. So therefore, this was the image the Arabs formed of America. Even the Arab reformists and the ones who called for a renaissance of the Arab nation at the beginning did not harbor any ill feelings or negative feelings towards America. They wanted to be inspired by the European model and build democratic societies, and the Arab reformists acknowledged the advances America made and the West has made, and at the beginning of the Arab Renaissance or resurgence had a dominant image of America until the beginnings of the 20th century, when they started engaging in anti-colonial struggles. And people like Muhammad Abdo al-Kawakibi and others were calling for using the Western model as an inspiration, and they did not see any contradiction between those Western values and Islamic ones. I'm just trying to give glimpses of what happened over a period of 2 centuries, and also the images formed by Arabs on America at the beginning of the 20th century and the beginning of America's engagement in the political life of the Arab region after its participation in World War One. The image formed by the Arabs was that America represented the 14th Principles by Woodrow Wilson and the support of the people's right to self-determination, etc. And also and what Wilson has said or did about insisting on people in Syria and Palestine having their say in determining their future in the peace conference. And this included two fundamental questions for the Palestinians, and the committee recommended the putting an end to the Balfour Project completely because this is totally against the principle of self-determination. As for the Syrians, it was noticed that the Syrian people were more inclined to choose America to supervise the transition before independence. So these two attitudes reflect a positive view of America. However, the period between the two world wars and until the period after World War II, the relations of Arabs and the Americans continued in this vein and this spirit, away from a military conflict, and the negative image was of England, France, on the other hand. And this is why the Arabs wanted the Americans to help them gain their independence from the French and the British, and even in the 40s, whether in Iraq, Syria, or the Lebanon, or even the Egyptians wanted America's support to gain their independence and also to enhance the role of their people in determining their future and destination. The beginning of the negative image started after the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That was the point where reservations started to appear, and when the contacts and conferences were held in America, and Zionism began to move its power centers to Washington. And after World War II, and some years later, the rulers of Arab countries and the ruling elites were no strange to the educational institutes established by the Americans in the Arab world, or the ones who went to study for their higher education in America. So therefore they were close to understanding the American thinking. Even Al-Wafd party asked the United States to help them to amend the agreements between Egypt and Britain at that time. The Egyptian revolution also had a positive view of the United States, and it was not a negative one at all. The turning point started with the 1948 war and America's recognition of Israel. So the first psychological shock occurred at that time. But despite Eisenhower's policy of alliance making and the different what Eisenhower decided or pushed Israel to withdraw from Egypt after the trilateral aggression. This position was appreciated by the pan-Arab nationalists and the Islamists, although the Islamists, in fact, from the 30s, started from the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928, who insisted on cultural independence from Western culture, and they always advanced the cause of Arab Islamist cultural identity, despite the fact that the beginnings of some books in the 40s, when they began to adopt a more cautious approach, like Umar Farrukh and al-Khaldi on Western missionary work and Western colonialism. But the relationship, despite that, even until the 60s, emphasizing the importance of taking a more cautious stance by the pan-Arabists, although the Islamists have sided with more conservative powers who were supported traditionally by the West. So therefore, the antagonism towards the West by the Islamists took a cultural complexion, and by pan-Arabists a political one. And also the relationship between the Islamists and this freeze relations with the West has gone through continued until after the 1967 war. What determined the relationship with the Islamists came in the so-called Second Gulf War, after the liberation of Kuwait, or during the liberation of Kuwait, and after that we saw the establishment of the fundamentalist Islamist movements and the Takfiri school of thinking, or the ones who call for the excommunication of others, and political extremism in Islam started to take more prominence. What happened after 1967 caused a major shock to Arab public opinion when Johnson became president, and the Arabs blamed America on their defeat and the continuous Israeli expansion. This shock was so deep that it has changed the cultural and ideological aspects of Arab life. So Arab Arabist nationalist movements began to adopt a Marxist ideology. Arab Islamists, or the vast majority of them, moved more towards extremism. In this environment, which was caused by the 1967 war and America's role in it, as from the period from the Second Gulf War until 9/11, and then afterwards the invasion of Iraq, this period saw a lot of events happening in the Arab-American relationships and changed a lot of views. America is no longer, of course, just a political stance, foreign relations. America is a culture, America is society, America is human aspects, and not all of these coincided with the political side. The Islamists really had a disconnection with America culturally, but right up until the 90s, other forms of relations continued. As for the Pan-Arabists, although their cautious stance began to exist from the 50s, but because of Israel's occupation of Arab land, the situation ended up in a state of conflict in cultural dealings, in people's feelings, and all of this culminated in America's position vis-à-vis the Arab Spring. Although America has taken some positive views of some changes, but neither liberals nor Islamists or Pan-Arabists were convinced with America's stance. Everybody was saying that America sided with their enemies. The worst of that phenomena when some Arab educated classes turned the political, social, economic economic social conflict into a political struggle, and they started reviewing their ideologies, and a large number of thinkers, whether they are Islamists or Pan-Arabists, started reviewing this black negative image of America as an enemy, which the likes of bin Laden created when he said the world is divided into two camps. And on the other side, when they saw that neither this totally negative image is good enough, nor the total American submission to Israeli diktats is good enough. So therefore, some people are calling now that for common areas with America and finding some basis for establishing a relationship good enough and beneficial to both sides.
Thank you very much.
حاتم تفضل.
Hatem, I give you the floor now.
Assalamu alaikum. First, let me thank the organizers and the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for this important conference. And it's part of a series of engaging not only in the Arab world, but broadly across the globe in looking at Arab relations with various parts of the globe. My talk today will be focused on Palestine, Islamophobia, and the centrality of pro-Israel producers of Muslim Otherness. And this work on Islamophobia is part of the center that we have at UC Berkeley. It's Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project. And I want to draw your attention. I brought with me 2 volumes of the journal, and it's available for you outside. So make sure to pick up volume 1 and 2 of the journal in an attempt to actually theorize and engage in the subject of Islamophobia in a systematic research, both in the US as well as in Europe. When we think of Islamophobia, we have to think about where the production of Islamophobia is coming from. And in here, these are 3 documentaries that are widely used and present in the United States, but also you see a replication of them available in Europe. Now, Daniel Pipes, for those who are in the United States, Daniel Pipes is a very well-known personality. He was appointed by Bush to the Institute for Peace, a quasi-US government institution. And post 9/11, and I quote it, he said, "I worry very much from the Jewish point of view that the presence and increased stature and affluence and enfranchisement of American Muslims will present true dangers to American Jews." So in that sense, in here looking at the increasing numbers of Muslims, and anyone who have looked at demographics of Muslims in the United States knows that there is an expanding increase, not because Muslims came to establish Sharia or all of a sudden wanted to convert America. It's because as a result of many conflicts around the world, the end result is you have massive movement of people into the US. You also had migration as a result of the technology, expansion of the technology sector, students that continue to arrive. But for Daniel Pipes and some of those who represent his point of view, this is seen as a threat. In particular, the increasing number and more so the enfranchisement. Beginning in the year 2000, Muslims began to actually vote as a bloc in US presidential election. A.M.J. Rosenberg, in looking at what Daniel Pipes is saying, he said that those who are working in the Islamophobic production, they believe that the more acceptance there is of Muslims here at home in the United States, the less reflexive hatred there will be for Muslims abroad. And that, in their view, reduces America's sympathy for Israel. Meaning the whole enterprise of Islamophobic production is to create a hatred in the American public attitude and views of the Muslims in terms of the Muslim world. And thus, when the United States engages in hostile policy that ends in the death and destruction of large numbers of Muslims, like what happened in Iraq and other places, that reflexive hatred does not produce any type of reaction because that hatred has been already developed within the larger American public. Now, foreign policy and policy in general is a complex process. I'm not using a singular approach to say this is the reason. It's a complex process. Part of it is think tanks, part of it is lobby groups, part of it is particular ethnic groups, part of it the media, universities. So it's a very complex process. One of those complex processes is the pro-Israel producers who constitute a small group within the US political landscape. They have a singular policy in terms of how to defend Israel. And in the US politics, taking on Israel is definitely a third rail of politics, is one of the fastest ways to derail your political ambitions and career. Now, how does it look in terms of the US public opinion in relations to Muslims and Islam? Analyzing a host of survey results, Professor Charles Kurzman concluded that the data illustrates how American attitudes toward Muslim Americans have grown more negative, and a growing segment of the population is willing to express negative views about Muslim Americans in recent years out publicly. And this is despite the fact that there were massive investment in resources to try to improve, quote unquote, the image of Muslims in the United States. And I have a view of some of those misguided approaches to try to improve the image of Muslims. Now, what caused the shifts, once again, into their negative attitude? Some say it's violence in the Muslim world. So there's this attitude that it's the violence and therefore these events. Once again, that's a theory or approach. Terrorism cases in the US, meaning using some of the cases that emerge in the US as a way to speak of the rising tide of this negative attitude. Ineffective Arab and Muslim PR. Also, Obama election as the first Muslim president in US history. There is 24% of the American public still believes that Obama is a closet Muslim. All right, so this discussion, especially among the Tea Party activists, this aspect of it continues to register some responses of thinking of him in that way. I also have the theory that people attack Obama on his supposed Muslimness, really their discomfort of his blackness is really there, and therefore Muslimness becomes a signpost for expressing racist attitude toward the first African American in the White House, and therefore speaking of being anti-Muslim is an acceptable discourse at this point, so they will feel comfortable in attacking him on his supposed closet Muslimness. Now, the documenting of the shift, we could see that the attitude beginning in the year 2000, right at the time where Obama begins to run for election, we see there's an upswing in negative attitude directed at Muslims. And therefore, one has to say that the major events in the Muslim world, whether it's the Afghan war or the Iraq war, have already taken place. And therefore, the question is, what is the reason for this shift? And that's where my argument that there was a considerable effort by the pro-Israel producers of Islamophobia to shift public opinion in such a way to maintain the United States policy single-handedly in support of Israel without any change in their perspective. Now, Islamophobic industry, and that's what we need to speak about, that there is an industry, just like you have an industry that is focused on one sector or the other, there is an Islamophobic industry that could account for the increasing negative data. And this points to the success of their effort in the United States, and also we could point to the success that is being registered in Europe in the most recent European elections, as well as elections, whether it's in France, in Austria, in Greece, where there's this rising tide of monetizing Islamophobia into the ballot box. And we could see some of that occurring in 2008 in the US election, but in Europe, definitely the monetizing of Islamophobia occurring. In this sense, we have to speak about latent and manifest Islamophobia using Edward Said's latent and manifest Orientalism. One way to understand it, once again, is that this latent Islamophobia production, in terms of whether it's media, documentaries, all this fit into creating this negative image and perceptions of Muslims. And here, when we use Muslims as a larger category, that includes Arabs in there. Latent Islamophobia is founded upon an unquestionable certitude conceived through an inception process utilizing films, news reports, media, talking heads, publishing books, problematizing Muslim subjects. Exclusive emphasis on Islam as a violent, backward, and oppressive religion, and Muslims' despotism and supposed lack of progress. In Orientalism, Said argued that Muslim subjects are constructed and judged in terms of and in comparison to the West, so they are always the other, the conquerable, and the inferior. Now, there was a report that was done in 2010, Fear Inc. report, that actually documented $42.6 million spent by the Islamophobic industry. And therefore, if you think of a product that you put $42 million to produce the needed result, you could have the result if the opposite side have not invested similar resources. And these are some of the major funding institutions, and then the major spokespeople for this Islamophobic industry. This year on September, CARE issued its own report, legislating fear report, and the Council of Islamic Relations identified a total of 37 groups at the core of the Islamophobic industry, and another 32 peripheral organizations spending a total of $119 million in the years 2008 to 2011 to drive the negative and discriminatory message in the United States. This report builds on the Fear Inc. report. So what we're dealing is with a committed list of organizations that have a massive funding, from the minimum of some of these organizations having million to 2 million plus. Daniel Pipe's outfit by itself has a $2.5 million budget with a campaign that is focused at demonizing and engaging the negative productions relative to Muslims in US political discourse. The inner core, these are the organizations that constitute the inner core, 37 organizations that are committed to producing Islamophobia. And what is interesting in this production is they all quote each other, they all replicate each other, so they have this effect of making a singular message to appear to be the broader message across the American political spectrum. In this sense, the American political leadership is afraid to engage because immediately they will be attacked by this organized, established core organization, and then a periphery of 32 other groups that are working almost 24/7 in this demonization process. Now, the Islamophobia campaign has goals. One is to demonize Islam, thus Muslims who believe in Islam are guilty. This is the same strategy that was applied in the United States toward the communists, and also was applied to Arab nationalists during the 1970s and 80s. If you were in the US in the 70s and 80s, you could not be part of a communist advocacy group and be accepted or allowed into civil society. If you spoke of the PLO, you were excluded, you were labeled as terrorists. So it's the same strategy now is deployed toward the Muslim subject. Criminalize Islam through link to terrorism. So every time that you have a discussion about Islam, the term terrorism is included. Isolate Muslims in American society. Marginalize Muslims in civil society. This would lead to further radicalization among the youth. Radicalization in some cases actually will lead to violence. Violence must be responded to by further security and military measures. Israel, once again, is the go-to expert to counter it. So essentially, the Islamophobic industry actually wants to encourage this isolated violence incidents because it rationalized their theoretical frame of actually engaging in a security method or a security structure. And increasingly, I use the term terrorism industrial complex. We used to have the military industrial complex. Now we have the terrorism industrial complex. And there are outfits, both corporate and otherwise, that are vested in the continuation of this process because there are many interests that are being served by this process. Now, there are not only that the pro-Israel groups that are benefiting, but there are other groups as well. The right-wing forces are benefiting. You could not imagine in Europe some of these right-wing organizations doing actually votes. How they're voting votes is they're using the Muslim subject in Europe to actually reach into respectability and gain votes on the ballot box. Military-industrial complex, just think about the expenditures that have been rationalized around the fear of Muslims who do not constitute a superpower. No one of their right mind would think that al-Qaeda constitute a strategic threat in its singularity toward the US as a superpower. But it's been rationalized as a way to drive this interest. Extreme Christian groups, Israel advocates, and Arab regimes. We have to begin to speak about Arab regimes that also ride the Islamophobic discourse to maintain themselves in power. Now, setting the latent Islamophobia, the production of the many of these documentaries, but most recently we have Pamela Geller ads that are appearing throughout the United States, which is basically says, in any war between the civilized man and the savage, support the civilized man, support Israel, defeat jihad. The implication of this is that the Palestinians are essentially the savages. And that discourse essentially is attempts to push the Palestinians from the arena of civil society, and therefore as a Palestinian or as a Muslim or an Arab, you're not part of the civil society, you're part of the savage. The interesting part is that the response to this ad was massive in terms of being negative. In San Francisco alone, almost 70 to 80 different organizations came together to coalesce to reject this ad, that the city itself, the mayor and city councils opposed it, and had the Human Relations Commission respond by actually engaging in attempting to push back against Islamophobia. Now, post 9/11 has to be understood in the following way. In the United States, pro-Palestine activists and Palestinians were systematically targeted. This is not recent, but actually there's a long history to it. From the 70s to the 90s, PLO and Arab national activists were targeted. Anyone in here should know about the LA 8 case. The LA 8 case is 7 Palestinian, 1 Kenyan that were arrested during the Reagan administration in LA because of their advocacy of the Palestine cause. And the reason they were arrested because they were passing Al-Hadaf magazine, something that is protected under the First Amendment rights in the Constitution, but their case continued for almost 20 years. Every time there was a new law that was passed, they were retroactively charged against it, including the 1996 anti-terrorism law and the 2001 Patriot Act. Now, 1990 to 2001, the containment anti-terrorism law in the US, Palestine activists post 9/11 were systematically targeted. 95% of all cases in US courts related to terrorism are connected to Palestine and not to al-Qaeda. And their United States security apparatus used preemptive prosecution in a similar way that the Israelis were using administrative detention to neutralize activists from engaging. In a similar way, the Israelization of US law became a systematic way to neutralize pro-Palestine activists in the United States in a systematic way. I'm going to go because my time is up. There was a whole communication strategy that was developed by the pro-Israel forces, which essentially to mirror US language in relation to terrorism as it relates to the Palestinians. So I'm going to conclude with the following. We have to differentiate between attacking Muslim communities versus defending Islam. Unfortunately, many of the individuals that engage attempt to try to improve the image of Islam without knowing that the way to improve the image, quote unquote, of Islam is not the problem. Somebody hit you with a fist in your face. The problem is not that you need to go to get a plastic surgeon to improve how beautiful your face. It is that there is a structure of power that makes it possible for the person to hit you in the face and feel secure that they will not face the prosecution. And what is needed is to empower the communities to have their self-assertiveness, to disallow anyone from attacking them, whether in the theoretical or in the real parts of civil society. Thank you.
Thank you, Hatem, particularly for the plug for the plastic surgeons. Yeah, that's right. The last speaker in this panel would be al-Qazzaz from University of California, Sacramento.
I would like to remind that Mr. Al-Qazzaz is one of the first academics who spoke about stereotypes since the beginning of the 80s, and he also contributed with some colleagues in the Arab Graduates Association. We worked together, AUG, to face the spread of these racist stereotypes, especially in the textbooks or in schools, beginning from primary schools and secondary schools in the United States.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khalil. And I would like to thank the organizer for this conference about the Arab and America. America is part of the Arab world. Whether we like it or not, it doesn't matter. It exists in military fashion, in financial fashion, educational fashion, and whatever fashion you may be thinking. So we need to dialogue about this subject. My second cautionary point, the slide which I'm going to show you, they are not necessarily very clear. I apologize for that because it was done in a hurry. And third is that I'm going to skip many of the subject in this talk. The talk is, the paper is very long and still not yet really finished. So I'm hoping to give you a general view on the subject matter. And I told Khalil to stop me whenever he wants to stop me, because he's my boss at this point in time. So the first part of the paper, it talks about the role of the textbook in the educational process. Textbooks are important in all fields, whether you talk about sociology or chemistry or what have you. And sociology is not exception. But there's something interesting about introductory courses in sociology. In the American system, it is considered to be part of the general education. So there are a lot of people take that course. The estimate is approximately 1 million students take this course every year. And where do they come from? They come from varieties of fields, but also they come from variety of ethnic communities. So there are Chinese, there are Vietnamese, there are Arabs, there are Muslim, and many, many others who take these courses. Now, I chose 20 textbooks to study. I was told by the publisher there are 40 major textbooks in the introductory field of sociology, and I chose half of them. And The purpose of this study is to find out how the Arabs and Muslims are treated in this textbook, and the method of study is to evaluate the general text in these books. I use content analysis, and this is what I did. Now, what are some of the topics which I am going to deal with? These are the topics of the paper. But if you notice very carefully, there's one interesting topic is missing. I don't know if any of you can guess. And that subject is the Arab-Israeli conflict. Practically, it did not exist in these textbooks. I say practically. But let's talk a little bit about some of the topics. 5 of the textbooks which I studied acknowledge the contribution of Ibn Khaldun to the development of sociology. That's 5 of 20, which is not that bad. But there's one textbook mentioned very interesting point. He said, American sociology is a Euro-centered sociology. They focus only on the contribution of Europe and America to this field. And they minimize the contribution of the Chinese or the African or the Arab or Islam. But because of the diversity, because of the globalization, they are giving more and more attention to non-Western contribution to the field of sociology. The other surprising things which I found out, 2 textbooks, they talked about Edward Said, in particular his book, Orientalism, and how the West used certain paradigm to study the East. But also, they mention his interesting article about the clash of ignorance, in which he attacked Huntington's thesis, the clashes of civilization. Now, the subject of Islam practically is discussed in all the textbook. But the discussion is somewhat brief. They talk a little bit about the 5 pillars. They talk a little bit about the life of the Prophet. And once in a while, they talk about the split between the Sunni and the Shia. Some of the textbooks do have negative information about Islam. One of the textbooks, for example, said the Quran contained the saying of the Prophet, something of this sort. But on the other hand, many other textbooks, they give a very objective, very balanced information. One of them, Masionis, give us a lot of interesting information about the Muslim. He said their population is approximately 1.6 billion, and the birth rate among the Muslim is very high. And because of that, by the end of this century, Islam will become the dominant religion in the world, something of that sort. Now, the textbook talk about, the textbook talk about the Muslim American community, and there's a lot of fascinating discussion about them. One of the textbook, he said the Muslim community is approximately 5 million people, and many of them live in South California, in Chicago, in Washington, and in New York. Most of the Muslims happen to be Sunni, but also he made the point that the Shia Islam is rising also in the United States. Also, the author said that if you study the views of the American Muslim, you will find out there's a lot of similarity between them and the conservative Jews and the conservative Christian when it comes to social issues like abortion, like gay homosexuality, or what have you. But there's one textbook made a very interesting point about the fact whether the Muslim in America will influence Islam at large in the future. And he made the comparison between them and the Catholic in the United States and how the Catholic in the last 40 or 50 years had influenced the policy of the Vatican and the Catholic faith, etc. The Arab American community is also discussed quite a bit in chapters about race relation or what have you. And again, I'm speeding up so I can try to finish on time. One of the textbooks tells us that the Arab community is approximately 1.8 million according to the US official statistic. But he cautioned us that this figure is not exactly correct. Probably the actual number may be double the number. In other words, the Arab American Muslim community may be 4 million people. And he said this community is very diverse. The community comes from varieties of Arab country. Their number is on the rise. Many of them are Christian. Many of them are Muslim. Some of them are recent immigrant. Some of them are old immigrant. And the community consists of many social classes, the professionals like the engineers, the professors, the doctors, but also there are the businessmen as well as the the skilled laborer. And most of the Arab American community, again, concentrated in many major cities like Los Angeles, like Dearborn, like New York, Florida, or what have you. Can I have water, please? My mouth is dry. You see, I'm diabetic, and I keep taking pills. Thank you. Oh, you cannot walk. What's the problem?
Sir.
Thank you, brother. Now, the subject on the Arab and Muslim woman, it is also fascinating. This is one of the subjects where you see a lot of negative statement about the Arab and the Muslim. One of the textbooks started the chapter on sex and gender by showing, and I think you see that on the slide at the bottom to the right, by showing two Muslim women draped in hijab, covering everything except their face, and they contrast that with a Western woman wearing a very short dress and what have you. And then he proceeded to tell us in detail the story of what happened in Saudi Arabia in the year 2011 when some of the Saudi women decided to defy the law of not allowing them to drive in the city. And he gave us a lot of detail about the subject. Another author gave us varieties of interesting negative comment, again on the Muslim and the Arab woman. He described the Muslim family in the following fashion. They are authoritarian, patriarchal, polygamous, patrilineal, and largely patrilocal. And then he proceeded to tell us Muslim women receive half the inheritance of a Muslim man, and a Muslim man can marry non-Muslim, but a Muslim woman cannot marry non-Muslim. A Muslim man can be polygamous up to 4 wives, but a Muslim woman cannot. Divorce is mainly in the hand of Muslim man rather than a Muslim woman. A lot of these negative remarks, by the way, they are negative, but many of them are factual. Did you hear what I'm saying? They are negative, but they are factual. And that is part of the sad story. Now let us move on. Female circumcision had attracted the attention of many authors, but the discussion surprisingly is balanced, surprisingly fair, with the exception of one of the textbooks. One of the textbooks in particular, the one by Ritzer, said female circumcision in Islamic practice. sanctioned by the Quran and sanctioned by the tradition of the Prophet. On the other hand, many others give us much better and more balanced view about female circumcision. Masonists tell us that female circumcision is practiced by 40 different countries, including countries of East Africa. And Masonists give us a map where the female circumcision has been practiced, and on and on and on. He said it's a practice not only in East Africa, but in some other country like North Africa, but also the practice by the immigrant from this country in the US and in Europe. So it is fascinating discussion. Now, stereotypes about the Arabs and the Muslims discussed mainly in the context of 9/11. But you must keep in mind that the stereotype predate 9/11, and as the previous speaker has mentioned in their talk. But 9/11 intensified the stereotypes about the Arabs and the Muslim. But again, I have to say that a lot of the discussion is very, very fair. One of them, and I'm going to quote only one of them, is a piece written by a professor of religious study. Her name is Salud at Seaman College, and she talked about the impact of 9/11 on the Muslims and the Arab. It became a part of the US government war on terror. And she go on telling us all sorts of details about what is happening. The deportation of the Muslim and Arab immigrant for a simple violation of their visa. Muslim men and Arab men are forced for fingerprinting, and their photo were taken as if they are criminals. And she tells us that despite the fact 9/11 happened over 10 years ago, the animosity against the Muslim and the Arab is still very high. And she quoted a Gallup poll took place in the year 2010, in which the respondents tell us 43% of the people still distrust the Muslim. And then she quote the statistic from the FBI that the number of hate crime against the Muslims and the Arab had increased by 50% between the year 2001 and the year 2010. Now, the subject of terrorism is discussed very extensively in this textbook, but surprisingly, again, the discussion is very balanced and fair. And one of the questions many authors raise that we need to understand the social context of terrorism, why it happened, and who are the people doing that, and for what purposes. But one of the...
Thank you.
I didn't finish. What time?
Give you an extra minute.
No, wait a minute. Then, Elena, give me 3 minutes. Let me share with you my closing remark.
1.5. Compromise.
We are sailing like James Baker.
See, we have to treat our colleagues from California nicely.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was going to show you some about visual sociology and a few other things, but I'm going to skip and going to my closing remark. And I like here to make maybe 4 simple or 5 points. Number one, the coverage of the Arab and Islam in this textbook is very considerable. And I was really surprised. Remember, these are not specialized books on Arab and Islam, but they talk quite a lot about them. Most of the discussion take place in all chapters, chapter related to race, chapter related to economy, chapter related to politics, and chapters related to inequality, and on and on. The third point, the coverage of Islam is more extensive than the coverage of the Arab. And there are varieties of reason for that. One of them, Islam is a world religion. Number two, there's a sizable Muslim community in the US, about 7 million. It's the second, it's growing very fast in the US, and it is considered to be the second largest religion in the US after the Christianity. And furthermore, Islam really part of the American history. About 10 or 15% of the slaves, they are Muslims. So it is not something new to America. The overall coverage of Arab and Islam tend to be very fair. Part of the reason because the author of the sociology textbook happened to be liberal. They deal with issues like poverty, like discrimination, like prejudice, et cetera, et cetera. And many of the authors, by the way, are aware of the fact that there are thousands of students who happen to be of Arab origin, of a Muslim faith. And many authors take into consideration when they write these texts, they have to please the audience in one fashion or another. The invasion of Iraq, for varieties of reasons, is not discussed except by one textbook, and that textbook makes a connection between the industrial military complex and the war on Iraq. And I wish I have the time to show you the picture. The two pictures of Bush and Johnson. And under Johnson, when in 1965, lied to the American people about the attack of Vietnamese on the American ships. This is the famous Tonkin Resolution of 1965. And Bush, when he lied to the nation, to the American people, about weapon of mass destruction, which never exist. Saudi Arabia is always mentioned in a negative fashion in these textbooks, and the Arab-Israeli conflict practically disappeared from discussion. Why? We can probably talk about it during the discussion period, but I need to say something. Do not confuse the discussion of the Arab-Israeli conflict with discussing Jews or the Palestinians. There are a lot of discussion about Jews and Palestinians, but not in the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And thank you for your patience.
Now it's your turn as participants. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate. Mr. Shamseddin spoke about confrontation between USA and Islamic extremist groups and said that that took place after the second Gulf War. The Al-Qaeda was established in 88 and its beginnings were in the 85 before its actual creation 88 and its project was announced. The Palestinian issue is always used by the Iranians, by Al-Qaeda, by Abdel Nasser, everybody who wants and all people consider the Palestinian issue a pivotal one. Mr. Hatem spoke about Islamophobia. Islamophobia is justified, in fact. The Muslims were accused in Oklahoma, but then it was proved that that was not correct. The first attack on the United States was by Al-Qaeda. Now there is a growth in the number of Muslims in the United States and the West, which threatens the nature of life in the United States, but we must be fair. USA had overcome the crisis of 9/11 a very fast way. Had this taken place in an Arab country or in Pakistan, we would have found a lot of revenge acts more than what took than the USA. In fact, many of the movements that are against Islam confuse between the mistakes made by the Muslims and the Islam itself. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the panelists. from Mr. from Marrakesh. Speaking about the stereotypes of Arabs and Muslims in the West in general and the United States in particular, calls for some remarks. First one is that we must always know that the West is diversified and it's not one unified bloc. And this even that applies to the United States. Mr. Ayad spoke about the communities. There are different visions even inside the United States himself. And we should also take in consideration that inside the Arab region and Islamic region there are some forces that give a realistic image of Islam that others might build, upon which others might build some images that are not stereotyped but realistic ones. We must admit them. That's why when you speak about these stereotypes and these images, some groups that speak in an extremist terminology or calls for ideas that are unacceptable, we must not accept that. The United States, after 9/11, we noticed that the United States made a lot of efforts and allocate a lot of resources to overcome this the gloomy image about the Arab world. In Morocco, for example, there were a number of efforts made that contribute to put aside this gloomy idea about the United States. For example, there is the radio station Sawa and supporting and helping some of the social activities and programs that have contributed in improving the image of the United States. But the question is, what did the Arab countries do? And what did the Arab elite, the Muslim elite did in the United States? Did they really want to overcome at least this part that's about the stereotypes and other efforts to improve the stereotype images? In the name of God, point of order and a comment and a question. Why the two second and third speech spoke in English and Arabic in a conference that is in an Arab country organized by an Arab center, and most of the participants are Arabs? The simultaneous interpretation usually for the language that is not the language of that country, and maybe this point translates the stereotypes about Arabs. As for my comment, since the English Joseph Kipling thinker and history said that the East is East and the West is West, they are two concepts and cultures that will never meet. This saying is being characterized and materialized on the ground. This saying is being fed by other sayings that speak about the supremacy of the white man and the white race, and maybe there's a folkloric song of the Negroes says that if you are white, you are right. If you are brown, stay away. And if you're black, you're doomed. So now I come to the question, and maybe the question is about Islamophobia, about Mr. Ayad, which is about the different dialogues, the religious dialogue or engagement, and dialogue between Arab and the Arabs in America, West-East dialogue. Can such dialogues produce a different situation that might improve the stereotypes about Arabs, and what conditions would that require? Thank you.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
السلام عليكم.
محمد الشبراوي.
محمد الشبراوي. a lawyer and political writer. First of all, I have a comment. Given the fact that we are now discussing an important relationship between the Arabs and the United States, that's why we need to raise a very important question. And given that I focus on this political issues, I would like to ask, what does the United States of America want, and specifically from the Arab nations? Does it want friendship with the Arabs? Does it want to only make sure that its strategic interests are protected? So that's what I'm saying. In general terms, that the big concept of American security has related American strategic security and interest to an important thing which we must all be aware of, which is the security of Israel in the region. The American policy in the region is still based on three characteristics. One, contradiction and a vision that's not clear, and not being able to understand how the things are moving in the Arab region and how the Islamic peoples are thinking. So, in my opinion, I think the American policies need to be corrected because it seems as if it is manipulating the interest of the region. The proof of this, as many people think, and this was a very good report that was presented at the beginning of the first session, in which reviewed the points of view of many Arabs who live in USA, shows us how the Arabs think in the region, and shows us the public opinion in the Arab world and the Muslim world that they not approve the American policies.
عندك سؤال؟
نعم.
تفضل اسأل.
The United States, it is clear that it refuses economic development of the region and is pushing the region into state of non-development. My question is, what does the United States want of the region, Arab region? And finally, the real tragedy is that the United States is our friend and of the region, and the tragedy is that the policies of the United States in the past period was in Dr. Azmi Bshara posed a very important question about relationships of Arab with US, which is we must understand ourselves by studying this relationship. And in this context, I would like to ask, what is Dr. Hatem, this question? What is the effect of the stereotype that was conveyed by the Arab media about Muslims and Islam to the West in formulating the image of Islam in the West?
Okay, مين بيحب يبدأ هون؟ Nick, go ahead.
I would try to speak in Arabic, but my accent would be impenetrable to most of the audience.
We don't want to reinforce stereotypes.
No.
Okay.
It's a comment really building on those of several who have already spoken, that while the topic is stereotyping, I think the conference should have had a session, or perhaps part of this session, where the successes are spelled out. The picture that I heard was one so dismal and facing such persuasive attacks on the Arab and the Muslim that I just don't think it's that bad. I mean, Pamela Geller, for instance, is a nutcase, and she's recognized across the United States as that. So I hope we could hear something about the progress that has been made that at least I've been hearing, as the Arab American community mobilized against Hollywood stereotyping. They have had some successes. Hollywood villains today are apt to be some sort of characterless, Oriental, maybe from Central Asia, where the names of the countries aren't pronounceable to start with, but it's the image of the vicious Arab, I think, has been more successfully combated than I've heard from you gentlemen.
Thank you. Who would like? Yeah, go ahead.
The questions were many. I'm going to tackle some of them. The last question is important. And while there were success stories, but the success stories are tangential to the epistemic, stereotypical demonization of the Arabs and Muslims, just for us in here in this room. Since the beginning of the 1980s, my rough estimate, and math is not my field, my rough estimate is that almost 7.5 to 8 million Muslims have been killed. Iraq, Iran war, First Gulf War, Second Gulf War, Madeleine Albright, 650,000 children in Iraq killed, and the price is worth it. That all is a result of the epistemic, stereotypical otherization of Muslims that Rosenberg says making the flexible or flex hatred toward Arabs and Muslims acceptable. It is not that bad, but let me give you even the worst. I didn't even go to the worst news. Since 9/11, and this is part of my work also on the Muslim Legal Fund for America, we had a total of 4,363 cases of Muslims that have been entangled in discriminatory legal cases. The standard operating procedure in mosques in the US is that there is a spy in every mosque under surveillance constantly. And I did interviews with people. Somebody said in their interview, I don't have the pleasure of thinking stupid thoughts to myself. I don't have the pleasure of thinking stupid thoughts to myself, meaning that they have already accepted a virtual internment where you're editing your own thoughts while you are by yourself because you are not certain or sure about that. On May 24th, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya came to the United States. He's been engaging in a project of Ta'ziz al-Salam, the renewal of engaging in peace. Supposedly he had a meeting with the State Department earlier. The Islamophobes attacked the State Department. The State Department apologized for having a meeting with him. While Pamela Geller is a crazy fringe, the crazy fringe have defined the terms of debate. So while engagement with the Muslims occur, the segment, that organized segment that produces Islamophobia prevent the engagement with the civil society, with the Muslims in such a way that you actually engage almost in pushing out any legitimate voice from engaging in the discussion. The question about the impact of the Arab world in reinforcing the stereotypical, when the coup in Egypt took place and the rhetoric that came out of Egypt, that just all of a sudden reinforced the reinvigoration. You could see some of the Islamophobes actually giving themselves high fives because all of a sudden the materiality of their discourse have been given a new lease on life. So that aspect of it, not only in terms of Egypt, but some of the dynamics that takes place in some of the states, whether Saudi Arabia and others, that constantly becomes the productive materiality that the Islamophobes actually engaged in. The question about the projection on the 10 years, I still think that Islamophobia is going to be with us because now it has been monetized into wedge issues for votes. And any politician that wants to ride a wave, especially right now in Europe, we're having 2 conferences in Europe coming up, one in December in Paris to deal with Islamophobia in the French context. We have a conference in Austria, in Vienna, in Salzburg, with the University of Salzburg to deal with Islamophobia in the German-speaking world, where a new rising tide of neo-Nazis that are beginning to actually win votes by using Islamophobia. So it doesn't look good, at least in the next, I don't know, 10 years is a little bit, but in the next few years is definitely we're going to deal in a much more systematic way of rising tide of Islamophobia and the large immigration of Muslims, whether it's from Syria, Iraq, or other places, that is putting pressure on European immigration policies, is giving a whole new nativist upsurge in Europe against the new immigrants that are coming, even though that Europe needs labor force, but the labor force that is coming in there is really highly problematic from their point of view, and we are seeing that is occurring, and we need to be aware of it.
Hatem, thank you. Do you mind responding, though, to one question that I feel is very important to this discussion? Not that all the others are not, but this particular one regarding the dialogues. Do dialogues help؟ هل الحوارات التي تتم على أصعدة كثيرة هل ساعدت في تحسين صورة العرب والمسلمين في الولايات المتحدة؟
Well, that's where my point is, that we're dealing with trying to do a plastic surgery for something that is structurally based on power and power relations and dynamics. And therefore, dialogue has been used as a way of us engaging in a public relations to improve our image rather than looking at policy. You know, I often get the invite, come to a dialogue. I said, I'm not a psychiatrist nor a psychologist to deal with your issues. I want issues that have specifically policy implication. If you don't have policy implication, I don't have the time to waste my own time, nor I want to waste your time and appears to be a psychiatrist for your own psychological problems.
شكرا.
Ayad, you spent some time studying this topic and writing a lot of articles about it, more than anyone else in the United States. Is there any progress, as was said in the beginning by the gentleman? Was there any achievement worth mentioning after all these efforts? And
If you don't mind.
We're out of time. So
No, but I
stick
need
with
to
that
answer.
one.
I need to answer.
Okay, we already answered.
No. There's one guy stating why we're speaking in English.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I need, in my notes, I was going to apologize for speaking in English, partly because I left Iraq in 1963, and my ability to speak in Arabic is not the greatest on earth. Otherwise, I love to do that in the Arabic language, and I hope in the near future I will do that. My second point, and I'll come to what you said, stereotyping is a human phenomenon, and don't kid yourself. The Arab are full of it, and the US people are full of it. And it's very difficult to overcome. But one way to do that is the process of education and a few other things. One of the good things which I noticed, and this is a little bit in response to your question, that Islamophobia had not reached the sociology textbook. I mean, surprisingly, the coverage is extremely balanced. There are minor negative points about Islam. As I said, there are some negative discussion of the Muslim and the Arab woman, but a lot of these discussions tend to be factual. It's true there's polygamous practice on occasion. It's true that the women in Saudi Arabia are not treated well, and it's true, and so, etc. So there is a little bit of success in that notion. Now, are there any improvement over the years in the last 20 or 30 years? Yes, a little bit. Not that much, but a little bit. It's better than nothing. But that's partly, in part, the fault the Arab lobby and the Islamic lobby. We can talk about the fact whether there is an Islamic lobby, whether there's an Arab lobby, and you are going to find out there's a lot of tension within the groups which make up the Muslim and the Arab, et cetera, and that, in one fashion or another, is going to affect the outcome. But today, at least even in the public opinion, the rate of negativism is not the way it used to be, and on and on. So there is an improvement, but not very large improvement. But on the other hand, that should give us the encouragement and the energy to do more and more and more to improve our situation.
Confucius said in one of his sayings, you should not stop the people from eating. So we'll take only one last comment from Shamseddin about what does the United States want from the Arabs, what do the Arabs want from the United States in the framework of this, and then we go to lunch. I'd like to answer the question of the gentleman about Islamic extremism, which began in the 60s, but that extremism was against the regimes, the so-called nationalistic progressive regimes that were military. But then the Islamic extremism took an international dimension, and that was beginning from Pakistan. The second Gulf War gave it other dimensions that were against the United States. In the beginning, it was not against the United States. It was against the Soviet Union. Before the dismantlement or the disappearance of the Soviet Union, the jihadists were against the communism, and so they were just like the West. But once the Soviet Union disappeared, it changed direction. This is the answer that I wanted to give you. As for what does America want from the Arabs? As an administration, as authorities, this question is based on what is the policies of the administration, not the people. The people want business, want to visit museums, etc. But the state, the government, looks after its interests. Every country in the world tries to increase its international law. This is something legitimate, and to protect it and enforce its interest. What our problem? We don't have a problem with Israel, with the United States, except its relationship with Israel. And they are so. Arabs had made so many concessions. Even the Israelis after 73 are convinced that the Grand Israel project is impossible. So now they want guarantees, they want security. As for the Arabs, their project to liberation of Palestine, since 73, they are now convinced that this is no longer possible, or at least they mitigated the idea that Palestine is totally Islamic. No. Now, those who are active in politics are thinking in a different way. There are, of course, still some factions that think that Palestine is only for Muslims. So our problem with America is this. If this problem is solved, the relationship with America would be very good. But the Arabs, what we want was a good economy. We still need training in technology, science, culture. There are so many things we need to be trained on. And also the West needs USA wants economic, comfortable and good economic relations that will make profits for them. USA is cautious that it is afraid of an Arab unity, that the Arabs should be one big state. Even the Soviet Union looked into the Arabs that their unity will be dangerous, have a very big nation on their borders. So every country wants to have relations with countries whose negotiation with whom is easier. But if there is a good relationship and between the Arabs and without any aggressive tendencies, that will be easy. And I think other than this Israeli issue, the Americans have no problem with the Arabs. On the contrary, in fact, the Russia now and Soviet Union are only have no problem. For example, there are problems with the United States wherever there is of Cuba The West was nothing like the Soviet Union or Russia that the ideological. No, they want their economic interests, and the deal thinks that to have democratic states or countries in the region in such a way that we can have a good relationship, investments, etc. This is what I think. I would like to end this session by a final word about the relationship with Israel. I think also there's a misunderstanding, a big one, in the Arab world and the USA about this topic. The problem today is not about the relationship between USA and Israel. Even as described by USA, it is special and distinguished relationships. No, the problem is in putting all the interest in the United States within the interests of Israel. And there is a contradiction between USA's attempts to serve its interests in the Arab world, most of which are in its bilateral relations with the Arab countries, and with putting all these interests, their interests, to the sake of Israel in such a way that as if relation with Israel is more important than bilateral relations with the Arab world. This is something very important to understand. I know this is a very sensitive topic. I am ready personally to speak about the person who raised the question about is Islamophobia justified. The answer is no, of course not. Especially for the United States, for us as citizens there, maybe an Arab point of view might justify that. But I spoke to many Arab heads of state, and one of them, in fact, said me, if such a thing happens in our country, I would have killed you all. He said to me that himself. But on the American level, in the United States, it's not allowed, it's not possible at all to accept or to justify Islamophobia as a result of 9/11. You can face and confront those who did that, but not all the Muslims. And this difference between life in USA and the other countries who are despotic. Thank you.